Hello, Dr. Campbell. So great to have you on the Vegan Champion podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time. How are you doing today?
Very good. Considering the circumstances, an
Considering
odd
this,
time.
indeed, it is an odd time. It is an odd time. And how have you been coping with the sort of new reality we're in?
Oh, I'm doing okay. It's this Zoom business, this virtual stuff is a little bit hard to get used to, but it's working pretty well. So I do a lot of that.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be able to connect, and it's bringing a new kind of dimension into,
Right.
people are at home, and so it's almost sort of easier to connect to people far away in a strange way.
That's right. It sure is.
So I would love to have people understand, your story. Obviously, you are I don't even know the right word for just how important you are to all of the work that's been done to sort of further the understanding of what protein is. I mean, the first question I'm tempted to ask you is just that question: where do you get your protein? Because really, the way that people answer that question now is largely based on a lot of the work that you've done. And so let's start though with where do you come from? You are not a typical animal rights activist. I've had animal rights activists on this program before. You are very much a researcher and looking at this from a nutritional point of view, and you make a point of sort of distinguishing between, some people will say, you've said, you're not talking about vegan or vegetarian diets. You're looking at the science of nutrition, and it's great for people who, do want to take those sort of ethical stances. But I think what you do is very valuable in that you're sort of separating and saying, look, aside from all of that, let's look strictly at the science of what is the nutrition, what does the nutrition science tell us? So you actually grew up on a dairy farm, is that correct?
Correct.
And so how does that all pan out? I mean, you grew up on a dairy farm, and eventually you're doing this, all of this research, and you really sort of changed your mind on things over the years. So give us a little bit of a story as to where you come from growing up on a dairy farm, and how does that all pan out into the work that you've done?
Well, I still consider myself primarily just a farm boy, if you will. I was raised in Virginia,
Hmm.
west of Washington, D.C. I actually milked cows, by hand, if you will. We had machines too. But in any case, there we're producing milk, obviously, and milk is valued, as you know, for its high quality protein, number one. And number two, it's valued too for its calcium content. But so I was the first in my family to actually go to university after that. My father had just a couple of years of education. He was an immigrant from Northern Ireland. And so he was anxious for myself and my brothers and sister to get an education. So I went away to school, undergraduate, had a year in veterinary school, then got an offer to do a scholarship at Cornell University. There, I actually, in my graduate program, I did a research dissertation. That's experimental research. Did a research dissertation on exactly figuring out better ways to produce more protein. And that meant protein from animal sources. So I was very much in that camp, clearly. Then after my graduate studies and sometime in postdoc at MIT, I then was appointed to a faculty in Virginia Tech University, biochemistry, Department of Biochemistry and Nutrition. And there we had a contract, by the way, from the US State Department to organize a program, a model program if possible, for feeding malnourished children in the Philippines. So I spent quite a number of years going back and forth to the Philippines, working with my senior colleague at the time to develop this program. And there, the consensus of the nutrition community was that malnourished children around the world are largely deficient either in energy, which some people call calories, or in protein, those two things. So what we were charged with was making sure these kids got enough protein. But then I saw something, without getting into all the details, that led me to believe there's a possibility that the few children getting the most protein, like we do in the West, had a higher risk for getting liver cancer of all things. That was supported in turn by a paper that came out at that time from India, experimental animal study to showing the same thing, higher protein, more cancer. So I was presented with a dilemma. How are we going to promote consumption of more protein, good quality protein from animals on the one hand, on the other hand, have to deal with this other question. So I came back home, organized a grant from our National Institutes of Health that looked at that question. Is it true that higher consumption of animal protein might cause liver cancer? That grant went on for 27 years. Kept getting renewed. We were publishing all that research in the very best journals. And yes, it was true. It was very dramatic. Animal protein in the form, in this case, of the protein from cow's milk. So here I am, you see, it was quite a little journey. And from my personal background, my graduate training, then on to doing this work, ending up sort of in a position to have to challenge what I thought I always knew. You know, more protein, better off we are, which is not true. So that study, though, allowed me to get into some really substantive, basic questions about the relationship between nutrition and health, especially cancer formation of all kinds. And we won't get into those details here, but as I got into these questions, I found myself challenging very fundamental beliefs about the whole cancer industry, about the drug industry, you know, about the kind of food we produce in the world. I spent 10 years during that time too, very actively involved in national policy development, working in Washington a lot, developing national policy on food and health policy. And so that went on for a while, and eventually then I had a chance to do some work in China, just when the United States and China were just opening their doors to each other. And I had a senior colleague from China in my laboratory. And so we organized a study in China to survey a large population across 170 villages across China to see if what I was learning in the laboratory was at all consistent with what might be seen in people in rural China. And sure enough, it was. So I've suddenly finally ended up with, after all this work, I ended up with a lot of basic laboratory research on the one hand, together with human epidemiological research on the other, largely in rural China, not entirely, but largely in rural China. The information was the same, essentially. So it gave a lot of confidence to me that we have something here to think about, something rather different from what we traditionally do. Certainly it was challenging from my own personal and professional background. And so I had to change my mind. And eventually I was working on some committees in Washington at the National Institutes of Health and elsewhere, often being the only one to be doing this kind of research, but usually always. People got interested in what I was doing, whether it was the cancer community or other communities. And there was one occasion when in 1978 to 79, when I was on a committee, and it was a committee evaluating grant applications for research. We were the ones sort of determined who got the money, who didn't, kind of thing. And there was some interest at that time, and mind you, this is 40 years ago, where there was some interest arising at that time about the possibility that nutrition was important in cancer. Now we know it is, but you know, in those days it was kind of novel. And some of the interest was dealing with, as I say, food, nutrition, certain kinds of cancer. So I was asked actually to make a presentation to my colleagues, something about nutrition. I didn't want to use the word vegetarianism because what I had arrived at that point in time was more plant-based. There's no question about that. And so I thought about it. I didn't know the word veganism. For me, I never heard of that word, but I didn't want to call it vegetarianism because that was not my motivation. That motivation that you mentioned before is an excellent motivation. I don't question that. That's not the issue. But at the same time, I wanted to make the argument that my entire existence, my rationale for doing what I did was based on science, fundamental science. And so that's what I did. And it turns out that what I learned is very consistent with the vegetarian vegan community, as you know. In fact, I might tell this, I'm not going to give his name, but probably one of the leading people in the country, in the US at least, advocating for the vegan lifestyle, basically from an animal welfare point of view. He called me up. He didn't want me to use his name. He says, this is after some time after I published the book, The China Study. He said to me, he said, whatever you're doing, he says, you're doing more than the rest of us put together. He says, keep doing it. And he knew what I was doing. I was using experimental animal research part, which is a no-no, which is unfortunate, but that's what it was. So that's my connection. Now, you know, I'm still a scientist. I eat this way. I appreciate those arguments, you know, the moral arguments, and that's not the issue either. In other words, now that we got a bunch of arguments, environmental as well, environmental, cost of health care, let's say, you know, and the basic science itself. And so it all comes together. And I think at this point in time, we are onto something, you know, totally, from different perspectives, different personal experiences. We got to change our diet. We got big problems in the world.
Absolutely.
And the sooner that we can get our friends elsewhere in our societies to understand this, the better off we're all going to be. So I'm going to continue to make the argument as from the scientific point of view that I learned what I learned. It was published in the very best journals in the country and internationally. I've lectured extensively. And so I'm finding now, and oh, by the way, that experience back on that committee, I didn't want to use a vegetarian vegan words, if you will, as I explained it. So I came up with this odd idea. Let's call it plant-based. That's where the word came from.
Really?
Yeah. So eventually, then I got into some more research having to do whether the nutrients in food are the same as they might be in supplements. And they're not. Nutrients in food work their magic. It's fantastic. But if you take them out and put them in pill form, you run a risk. They're either not going to work, or they might actually have the opposite effect. So I then stuck the word whole in the front of it. Whole food, plant-based. That's where the word came from in the late 1978, 79. So, and I tell you that because that word now has become pretty almost commonplace, and I hear it a lot. Yeah, go ahead.
I just a question on that, because there has recently been, I believe, kind of a hijacking of that term. My understanding of the term was that it was always sort of a way of, as you said, putting aside any ethical arguments, valid as they may be, and talking about the diet. Like, this is about the food that we're eating for a nutritional reason. But your intention of it originally, can I just clarify, was 100% plant-based. It does not mean plant-based is like, oh, I mostly eat plants, but I still eat some chicken and milk, but it's mostly plants. Because that seems to be what's happening, is people are hijacking the term plant-based now to mean mostly kind of vegan. So what was your original intent of the term?
Well, your comment is excellent, by the way. And it's made me go back and reflect a little bit on my choice of those words, whole food, plant-based. And I could have done better. I was trying to think of something better the night before I was giving a presentation to the committee. And that's what I came up with. I think that it could have been better. But what you're raising, the question you're raising, and others have raised too, am I talking about 100% plant-based, or is it, like you say, doing your part way? Here's the way I address that question. I'd like to, rest my comments on sound science. So here's what I say. For me, the goal, the ideal, is 100%. That is the goal. But at the same time, I have to say that I don't know of really good empirical published science that says everybody has to eat 100% to be healthy the rest of their lives. We don't have that kind of research, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, we have got a lot of sort of circumstantial evidence and other kinds of evidence that suggests that even a small amount of animal food intake, even a small amount, can cause problems. In China, for example, we saw that. We saw it in more experimental kind of research. In fact, what I'm referring to is if you look at the relationship between animal protein intake and different disease outcomes, let's see, and people have done that over time. They sometimes don't refer to as animal protein. They'll say saturated fat, or they'll say something else, skim milk, for example. But they're really talking about animal protein. If you do that sort of correlation in the graphically, the regression line for animal protein for all these different diseases in different countries, that regression line goes less linear and goes right through the origin, the XY origin, which says, in theory, as soon as you start putting little animal food in your diet, we're asking for, we can experience increased risk. Now, whether that happens to everyone or not, of course, it doesn't necessarily happen straight off, but in due course, it does. So the question then becomes, for me, well, if the goal is 100%, why don't we do it and stay there? Well, that's what I argue, because there's other reasons to be 100%, aside from the welfare reasons. There's a reason just simply, if we start eating that way, 100%, and not taking added oil, for example, which is pro-inflammatory, if we do that, then you become accustomed to that taste. That's a critical step. And it's amazing how soon we can become accustomed. Maybe a month or 2 or 3, but most people agree with that. Once you get there, then you're in a position kind of looking back at what you did before, and you say, what in the world did I do that for? So then all of a sudden, there's a very practical reason to be 100% and stay there, even though I might not be able to defend that everybody should, in essence. So it's a little tricky question. I'm glad you raised that, because I know this has been a discussion of recent times, but I still say, let's go 100%, stay there. And and there's lots of other reasons for doing that now, especially given even the COVID-19 problem that we are now experiencing. We can talk about that in a moment.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
But every time that we see the word nutrition, the basic fundamental scientific argument for what nutrition really is and how it works suggests we should be, as near as possible, 100% plant-based.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent answer from my perspective, and I think that my thinking is completely aligned with what you said there. Is that, like, it must be very difficult from a scientific perspective to prove that 100%. I mean, that's got to be very difficult to prove that kind of thing.
That's right.
But in practice, somebody who's got the attitude of, look, I am aiming for the healthiest diet, therefore I'm going to aim for as much as possible whole food, plant-based. That is the goal. That's the practical goal. And the more people say, oh, just a little bit of this won't hurt, or just a little bit of that won't hurt, it can be, I mean, it probably depends on the person, but that can be a very slippery slope.
Yep. Well, that argument, that incidentally played out with respect to the smoking question of lung cancer some years ago, because, it said, okay, smoke is bad, and people generally understood that. But then it's very difficult to tell, if you're a doctor, to tell a patient, hey, you got to quit smoking. But, oh, yeah, okay, you can have a cigarette or two, maybe, on some occasions. You can't do that. That kind of research has been done, because the first thing you know, the person is right back on the wrong track again. So it doesn't work that way. And I think the same argument applies here. That if you start cheating, that's a slippery slope itself.
That leads into another question I've really been wanting to ask you. A lot of people talk about calories, caloric restriction for weight loss. Some people will say that if you're eating as much as you want of whole food, whole plant-based foods, if you eat as much as you want of that, it's very, very difficult to overeat. People give kind of different guidelines and ways of thinking about how much to eat, right? Like how do you think about, advising people to know, because I think because food, perhaps similar to cigarettes, can be somewhat addictive, especially if you've got perhaps, added salts and sugars and sweeteners and animal products. Are animal products addictive in the same way that cigarettes are, perhaps? And do these sort of addictive, we'll use that word, some people will talk about food addictions and things like that, and different ingredients that make more foods more or less addictive. And I think people are very confused as to how much to eat. And I think it gets thrown off perhaps by these sort of stimulating foods. And so people do these crash diets and they think that they need to, eat a starvation diet just to lose weight. And I think that people could really use some guidance on that. So could we get some words of wisdom as to know how much to eat?
Well, first off, there's a general rule of thumb coming from nature that the amount of food we consume is pretty much determined by calories. In other words, we need to have a certain amount of food. That's what we up to a certain limit. So it's there. That tends to drive our habits. Getting enough food to eat, period. In a sense. Of course, we choose different kinds of food, and some foods are more calories than other foods, and so forth. I do have to add a comment, though, from the scientific point of view. There is no such thing as a calorie. Not in a materialistic sense. There's no such thing. All it is the measurement. It's a measurement of the degree of heat or energy. And you only can determine that by taking a substance in the food, putting it in a calorimeter, we call it, or not a calorimeter, in a burn it, if you will, combustion thing, and then measure how much heat does it give off. So it's just only a measurement. It's like, it's the same as inches or feet. It's kind of crazy. We think of it as a substance. It's not a substance. Okay, but having said that little quirky thing, on the other hand, we can overconsume calories, if I can use that jargon. Overconsume calories, we can gain some weight. When the whole food plant-based diet first was coming for us, usually in a form of veganism at that point in time, there is an argument, a pretty good scientific argument, that you're going to eat less calories in that form of diet, because what you're doing when we're eating the whole food, the plant-based food, we're consuming more fiber. We're getting fuller quicker. So, the stomach is extended to a certain point, and we will tend to not eat as much. So the argument rose, eat more, weigh less, was the title of a couple of books that were contesting with each other at the time. That was an overstatement. Okay. Because now we know we can overeat on plant-based foods and have obesity problems. It's easy. Because all we need to do, okay, in a vegan setting, we're not eating animal foods, fair enough, right? But we're going to get calories. We're going to get calories someplace. We kind of fill up, and that is the highest source of calories, and it's very addictive. So we start adding
fat,
more and more.
Sorry, you said fat is the highest source.
Yeah. So the more and more fat we consume, usually in the form of added oils, even so-called good oils from plants, but usually in the form of added oils. And it really is addictive. We start using oil in our foods and stuff like that, maybe in cooking and dressing, so forth and so on. We have a tendency to use more and more because that's one of our bad habits. The same with sugar or salt. They're all kind of addictive kinds of substances. And so what happens with the vegans oftentimes is that they may, of course, they're not consuming animal foods, but what they still want to get calories. And so they use more of the high calorie foods, especially added oils, and they get in trouble. So the health consequences of being a vegan on average are not much better, well, somewhat better than eating animal-based food, because they're eating food that's rich in fat and sugar and salt, if you will. It's a nasty addiction. So what I'm saying, let's go eat a whole plant-based foods, the whole thing, right? And just have a little bit of modesty about it, and know that we can stray off a bit. For some people, a lot of people not, but some people stray off and just dump on the oil and the sugar and this and that and everything else. That's not good. That's not good. So, eating a plant-based diet helps to control calorie intake, if we want to talk about it that way. It certainly helps, but it's not the be-all and end-all for every single person.
Yeah, I think that that's very helpful for people to sort of realize the the benefits of eating a plant-based diet in the way that you're intending the term. And by the way, just quick, have you thought more about, like, if you could turn the clock back and use another term, have you thought about like what term you would prefer?
Yeah, good question. I thought about that so much I just bored myself to death. I can't think of much better. But a minor change. Instead of saying whole food plant-based diet, uh, I probably should say whole plants, whole plants, whole plant-based diet.
A,
You
a,
know,
a whole plants diet, maybe a whole plants
whole plant diet, something like that. You can throw those words around. I'm going back and forth on this thing,
diet.
and but now the whole food plant-based thing is kind of stuck.
Yeah, it has. It
But
has.
there's a little bit of nuance there that we can talk about. But
Yeah, and I mean that's what I was going to get into, is like, that's, I think it's very good to make that distinction. You have your, standard, and even with non-vegan diets, you have your standard American diet with tons of fried food and processed, and then you have, maybe, I don't know, another, like a Mediterranean diet, or like a diet from somewhere else in the world where they have a much higher amount of plant-based foods in the diet. Like, there's differences, right? It's not just vegan versus non-vegan, right? We do need to, if we're talking about nutrition, we need to consider the nuances there. And I think that's a good distinction to make. If you're eating, is it fair to say this, that if you're eating a truly, as you mean, whole foods, plant-based diet, no added oils, no sugars, or at least very, very minimal amounts, that you are basically able to eat to satisfaction? Like, is that a fair guideline? Like, if you're eating the right
yeah,
foods, eat till satisfaction.
yeah, that's right. Just be conscious of the idea that we can overeat if we are stressed, if we are this or that or something else. There's a statement, there's a belief in China and Asia in general, I think. They eat to 80% fullness. That goes back centuries. And if we're eating away and if you stop and think, as we're tending to get full, okay, do we really need to have that next bite? Sometimes you stop and think about it a little bit, you don't. Yeah.
I'm curious as to your diet, and like what do you eat? Could you walk us through, like, what do you eat in a day? Like, just a typical
Well,
day, just what.
my stock answer is I eat whatever my wife fixes me.
That's a good
Oh,
answer.
well, we've been married for 58 years. She's gone along with this really well. We've
Oh,
had
that's beautiful.
grown children and grandchildren and so forth. So we all do this. It's 100% essentially. But in the morning, it's almost standard for all of us, I guess, in this business is oatmeal. Cereal, oatmeal with some fruit on it. And if one wants to have some liquid on it called milk, don't use the dairy. Use there's plant milks we can use. I tend to not use any kind of milk, just hot oatmeal, maybe cold cereal. With lots of fruit. That's
Mhm.
it. Sometimes we have pancakes, more or less same thing. It's a cereal and fruit with a really big helping of fruit mix or something like that. Then at
Sounds good.
lunchtime, it's salads of all kinds. I mean, we really get to a point, you're maybe probably the same way. I crave a salad.
Yeah.
You can't go for more than 2 or 3 days yet. I've got to have a salad.
Yeah.
So we have that for lunchtime, maybe soup. And then in the evening, a little, more robust meal, if you could say. Cooked food, obviously. It's okay. It's no problem there. And my wife has got a bunch of recipes. Actually, those recipes too. Our daughter Leanne has a China study cookbook,
Oh, wow.
and,
Your
and
daughter,
also,
your daughter's name is Leanne. That's actually my mom's name.
oh really? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's she. In any case, she was in education, but she made this book, created this book, and there's been two versions of it. It's done really well. It's called the China Study Cookbook, and our daughter-in-law, uh, Kim Campbell, also has a book called Plant Pure Nation or Plant Pure Cookbook, something like that. Her
We'll put it in the
husband,
show notes.
our oldest son, who was the director of a film called Plant Pure Nation. that you could get on Amazon and Netflix. And
Yeah, people
so
should
his
check that
wife,
out.
Kim, incidentally, she's offering online quite a lot of cooking shows, if you will, how to cook. She's quite good at that.
Beautiful. I'll make sure to put that in the show notes so people can check that out and get all the recipes.
Yeah,
Oh, there you go. Phone
I
call.
got a quick test here.
Sure. Yep.
Okay.
No worries. It's but yeah, that's great. So you know, I mean, I'm sure it's a hard question to answer because I'm sure it varies on the season, and you know, you want to get different vegetables in and stuff like that. But yeah, that's great. So I'll make sure that people can check out, you know, some of those resources if they're interested in some of the recipes. Um, yeah, so you know, it's really interesting to speak about nutrition. Sorry, go ahead if you need to take that. So the context in which we're speaking right now, I mean, if we can maybe move into a little bit of what's happening in the world right now, you know, there's some people who are upset when I bring up kind of some relevant facts to our current situation. Mainly being, you know, one thing I talk about is, okay, we can talk about vaccines and we can talk about social distancing and all this stuff. And I'm not necessarily against any of that, but I would like to also add to the discussion that it is important for human beings to have a healthy immune system. And there's a relationship there between food. And I know that it's a touchy thing to bring up in a sensitive time, but I think we all need to hopefully, as you say, like you know, 40 years ago, it was sort of outlandish to say, oh, maybe there's something going on here. You know, the relationship between nutrition and health, basically. Like, but I mean, now it seems as though, I mean, have we really come so far? Are we still stuck in a sort of age where people are? I mean, doctors are still sometimes, you know, surprised to hear people say, oh, doctor, do you think maybe I should change what I'm eating and that might help my condition? Oh, no, it doesn't matter what you eat. You know, there's still that mentality still exists. Um, how do you approach, you know, speaking about this issue in this time when people are sensitive and perhaps, you know, don't want to be told that, you know, they may have a better chance of surviving any pandemic if they have a healthy immune system? Like, am I out of line to be thinking that, you know, in the midst of a world where, you know, there's a pandemic going around, that if you're eating a diet that supports a healthy immune system, you know, am I going to, am I putting my head out to get chopped there, or is there some validity to saying that?
No, there is a lot of validity. It's very, very important. And I'm glad you raised this. We have a new book. I just finished a new book. It'll be coming out in December, discussing this question in a sense, especially in the historical context. I got a lot of pushback for many, many years for some of the things I was doing and saying from my own community. And I was at Oxford University for a year, and I went back to look at the literature and the old literature and English literature. Found fascinating stuff in the 1800s, late 1700s, on into the 1900s, that actually kind of set the stage for the situation we're now in, either in regards to nutrition information, but also in regards to the way they practice medicine. So that book is coming out, as I say, in December. And I written with my grandson, who's a literature, excellent writer kind of person. And so, to answer your question, it's just had a long history. We kind of got stuck in this place. And what I have finally arrived, we didn't talk about this, but my own research over the years is there's a one thing that I think that stands out for me. Maybe two things. Let's avoid animal protein. We don't need that. That story about animal protein started in 1839 when it was first discovered. And it was given the name protein from the Greek word proteos, which means of prime importance.
Hmm.
You sort of begs the question, why did they think of this as prime importance? They discovered that this is the first nutrient discovered, and they gave it that name. So there was already at that time a fairly strong feeling, but what it did, it came from meat. And therefore, all of a sudden now we had a scientific justification for consuming meat or animal foods. That's why you get your protein. Well, a lot of that history fed on itself and exacerbated the problem. And so we just got to a point over the years, over 150 years, to now find scientific justification for eating animals, which is not valid. And that's the story I'm sort of telling in the book. Um, there was a second part of your question that you were asking. I forget what it was.
Speaking about this, the importance of nutrition and supporting a healthy
Oh,
immune
yeah,
system
okay.
amidst the pandemic is
Right, right.
touchy topic.
Well, in any case, it led me all of that stuff. Looking at the nutritional effect, if you will, in a variety of ways and in some detail biochemically. It turns out that I have a very different perception and even definition for nutrition than what I had myself. I mean, I taught upper class nutrition and introductory biochemistry in the university for many, many years. So the position that our research led me to is nutrition should not be considered only a bag of nutrients, each acting independently. That's wrong. But we talk about nutrition in the context of how much fat, how much protein, how much fiber, how much this, how much that. That's not the way to think about it. It's very misleading because nutrition is comprised of almost infinite numbers of nutrients and nutrient-like substances. Can't even count them all. I mean, there's so much. And when in the form of the whole food, when that's consumed, the body seems to know what to do with it. Kind of breaks it down, digests it, absorbs it, sends it here or there in every place, and it participates then in our needs, our metabolic needs, if you will. And it turns out there's that activity is infinitely complex. We'll never ever work out all those details. And even if we theoretically could, it would change in the next nanosecond. And this is going on at more than somewhere between 10 and 100 million, 100 trillion cells, none of which can be seen with the naked eye. Imagine that. Every cell is like a universe. And within that universe, there's just infinite complexity and reactions going on and so forth and so on. You stop and think about it that way. I think of it as what I call a holistic concept. That's nature at work. Okay, that's the first thing we really need to know is that nutrition cannot be oversimplified. The best way to the simplest form is just make a decision of what to eat. And my suggestion is eat whole food and basically make sure it's plants. And that would cover most of our needs, just doing it that way. But as far as the science is concerned, it's infinitely complex, always adapting. That's nature, always adapting. And so nature seems to know how to keep us healthy. All we need to do is give ourselves the right food.
I've, I mean,
That's, so with that in mind, and understanding nutrition that way, rather than starting out with something definite about some specific nutrient that's only confusing because it's often out of context, rather than starting that way, let's back off and recognize that the whole thing is really what matters. That's where the real health comes from. Far less confusing. Keep the message simple. Just eat this whole food. And if one is in science or philosophy or something like that, want to know more detail, it's fine and dandy. Go work on it, figure out what's going on. But the message is really simple. And it's almost like end of story.
yeah, I mean, from my limit, like, look, I'm not a scientist. I'm just trying as a normal person to understand and kind of make sense of, a little bit why it is that plants seem to be so health promoting. One of the things that I've heard about and am trying to understand is sort of the microbiome and the influence that, plant foods help to create healthy, gut bacteria and so forth, and that the immune system is largely sort of dependent on some of those functions in the body, and that by, eating to get sort of specific, but like a high fiber diet, for example, I believe it sort of helps to feed some of the gut bacteria and the important, parts of our immune system that rely on that. And that, if there's a pandemic going around and it's like, well, whether or not you survive may depend on how strong your immune system is. Is there some validity there in saying like, look, we need to perhaps you know, for our immune system's sake, people should be eating plant-based diets rather than just, I mean, sure, maybe the, you know, the masks, social distancing, vaccines, not saying that necessarily any of that is a bad idea or unnecessary, but is this another defense mechanism that will, you know, help people to be resistant, you know, and resilient to sort of, you know, viruses, or is that just, you know, it doesn't, do you think it doesn't matter how healthy you are, you get this COVID thing, it's just a roll of the dice, whether or not you're eating plants, it's not going to matter?
Well, that's a very good question. First off, I totally agree with what you just said. Let's abide by the social practices that you suggested, you know, to reduce our exposure to the virus if possible. So the face mask, social distancing, I really dislike it. And I don't think many people want to live that kind of life all
Yeah.
the time. And so, but they're important. Let's also have some tests to see whether or not we've been affected or not affected. Let's have some tests too to see if we have been affected and maybe we formed antibodies. That's another sort of angle there. Here's the story that I am now basically just bringing to the attention of the public. Namely, it's this. The whole nutrition concept, as I just described it, whole food, all these nutrients working together, what they show, what that does, is it prevents a whole host of degenerative diseases. It's almost a total panoply of just all kinds of diseases. But most of our information has come from studies on heart disease, cancer, diabetes, so forth and so on, obesity. And so it's the same strategy to reduce the risk for all of them. Okay, and this, incidentally, it's not just about preventing them. Now we know you can use this kind of disease to actually treat people who have the problem. It goes back the other way. So it's both prevention and treatment. Mostly focused, as I say, on degenerative diseases, and then
Right.
at the same time, it also enhances athletic performance. Believe it or not,
I've
that's
noticed
another
that.
angle that's important. And then, as far as these different systems are concerned, you told about the immune system, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or the gut microbiome. They're all, we sort of arbitrarily class them into certain systems. The microbiome is, of course, an infinite number of organisms, zillions of different kinds of organisms that our gut that plays a role in various and sundry ways, many different ways. In fact, my master's thesis many years ago was exactly on that. I did, I think, the first microbiome study ever done, but I could change the digestion patterns by introducing the organisms from one species to another, and it can change it. But anyhow, that's another story. There's lots of systems. There's microbiome, as I said. There's the acid-base balance thing, which is a very touchy subject. It has to be just regulated within certain limits. There's the immune system. There's the cardiovascular system. You know, there's all kinds of, there's the neurological system. All of these are grand, big systems that seem to address certain kinds of points of view. It's true what you said. People have thought that the plant-based diet that prevents heart disease, that's prevention of degenerative diseases, they're coming to realize, yeah, there's something there, it really works. They have kind of set aside the idea that that same formula can work on viral diseases, like the current pandemic, right?
Mm-hmm.
That has not been part of our conversation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in science, has not been part of the conversation in medicine for sure. That maybe that doesn't work there, kind of thing. Well, it turns out in our study in China, where we were actually surveying diet and disease mortality rates for what turned out to be 170 different counties in mainland China and Taiwan, and we measured, you know, lots and lots of things, all kinds of disease rates, and we collected all kinds of information on blood and urine and food and analyzed food, and we had lots of information on nutrition. So that study actually enabled us to look at complex issues with some granularity, you know, looking at specific things, how they arrange one another. Turns out we also included in that study 4 diseases that are caused in large measure, or at least enhanced in large measure, by viruses. And in one case, that's a hepatitis B virus. In that case, we studied in some detail because that was focused on its causing liver cancer. And liver cancer was another hat I was wearing in cancer, working with liver cancer. And so we had an opportunity of measuring in that study the amount of antibodies against that virus, as well as the amount of antigens, as they're called. Antigen is the native form of the virus, the active form. So antibodies, basically, let's call it for sake of discussion, that's the inactive virus. Antibody, antigen is the active, so we got antigen, antibody, right?
Mm-hmm.
So viruses, they all have different, and they all tend to cause different symptoms. That's a given. We know that. You just name it, almost any name it, I think it'll be a virus that kind of does that. When it infects us, we get all these different symptoms at the endpoint. We all think they're all unique and all very different. No, they are in that sense. However, they have something in common. When we become infected with those things, that is, the virus is landing on us as a host, if you will, and the viruses survive by being on hosts. They can't even multiply themselves, really. They use our machinery in the cells to multiply themselves. They're very insidious. So viruses can be nasty. Obviously, it can be very nasty. So when we get exposed to it, the first thing the body wants to do with all these viruses is to come to its defense by forming antibodies. So for a lot of viruses, we eventually form some immunity, usually in the form of the amount of antibodies, right?
Right.
Coming back to the China study, what we did there, we measured the amount of antibodies in a total of 8,900 adults, the amount of antibodies in all these people as a function of various nutritional practices, including different measurements of plant food consumption, different measurements of animal food consumption, and a number of other things. But it turns out that the consumption of vegetables in that population is highly, highly statistically significant with more antibodies.
Wow.
It's the only study of this kind, I think, so far published any place in the world. So what we saw was a highly significant, statistically significant, if you're familiar with statistics, it's a probability level of 0.001. I mean, it's like one chance in 1,000. So in any case, so what we saw, this is real empirical data. I'm not making this up. It's not that people consuming more plants, more antibodies to that virus. Very striking. And we measured different ways to prove the point. At the same token, people consuming more animal food, and it only took a small amount, because in rural China, they didn't consume that much. But people consuming more animal food, less antibodies. Therefore, that means when there's less antibodies, there's more antigen. The virus is active. Now it can do its dirty work. In that particular case, that virus causes liver cancer. It turns out, and this is studied within the laboratory, this is experimental animals studies in this case, but I'm sure it's the same thing. The hepatitis B virus causes liver cancer, period. When it's in active form like that, it turns out when we give more animal protein consumption, the liver really turns that liver cancer on. Unbelievable. So the consumption of animal food from that study we have, more animal food is associated with more viral activity, more symptoms, let's say, and less antibodies. In contrast, consuming more plant food, more antibodies, right? And the big difference, more antibodies and less of the activation, less symptoms.
So basically, if I can let me just make sure.
Yeah, go ahead. No.
So just check my understanding here. So in the study that you did, you were looking at, what was it, 8,000, 7,000 people or something?
8,900.
8,900 people.
900 adult people. So
what you found is a correlation between basically their body's ability to create antibodies they're going to be able to do that better. Their body's able to produce more antibodies. The more vegetables they're eating, the less animal protein they're consuming. Right? Got that? Because I'm not.
The more you say it again, the more vegetables they consume. You said something about protein. I missed that.
The more vegetables they consume, it helps them produce more antibodies. The
Right.
more animal protein they consume, it
Less than.
seems to inhibit their body's ability to
Yes,
produce antibodies.
exactly. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal because what this says is that will generally work. I'm going to suggest this is a lot of stuff's got to be proven, but you know, in biology, there's certain things that are commonplace. That kind of phenomenon will exist, as far as I'm concerned, for virtually all viruses.
Mm.
So that means we're being exposed to viruses continually on a continual basis. We have epidemics all the time. If people are eating this way, that is a plant-based diet, they're going to be continually resistant to those problems. So it's a long-term solution as well as to some extent a short-term solution. And I say that advisedly because somebody already got the symptoms, you know, they're not eating. Well, you can't do much there with that. Obviously, that's too late. But you can, for those who are infected, once they test positive, before you know, they're without symptoms, asymptomatic positive testing people. If they change their diets like that, we just begin to see changes, significant changes in 1 to 2 days on something pretty amazing. Certainly with a week and even more in a month and so forth. But the point is that if we consume this kind of diet all the time on a continual basis is what we should do. We're going to be continually resistant to those viruses, or let's say much less resistant. The viruses still land on us. I don't think the diet has anything to do with that. You know, we may get exposed, but fortunately for a lot of people, if you got a good immune system, you know, you're going to hardly even know that you were ever infected. That's the story. And some of the data is now just coming out sort of prove that point. That they'll tell you that for some they'll say it this way: for some strange reason, you know, 80% of the people seem like they had the virus, but nothing much ever happened, or just something similar. They didn't detect it. Well, they were doing something, whatever it was, not altogether dying. Most of the people who are dying from this disease are people whose nutrition has been compromised. That is to say, they are not using the plant-based diet. That's why they're dying. They're in that position. It's like 95, the figures are between 95 and 99% of the people, older age, who are dying from this are obviously suffering these diseases like heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and so forth. That's why they're susceptible to it.
Well, I'm very glad I asked you that question, and that is an extremely I think important answer for people to hear, right? And
Yeah,
I mean,
that's right. Just change their diet.
yeah, but there's obviously some science to back up, you know,
Yes.
what my thinking is that I was not aware of. I was not aware of you know, that's science
Yeah,
that backs up.
I do want to make a point about that since you're not in science. You know, there's various degrees of scientific significance. Okay. A lot of science, we will say we believe such and such and such and such, right? Based on the data we have.
Mm-hmm.
We can always use more data, you know, to make more certain a statement we may have.
Mm-hmm.
So statements we may make, you know, as to what we believe to be true, there's some degree of relativity here. If we want to be absolutely certain, which I would argue we should never be absolutely certain, but there's some methodologies in science that we use, like the randomized clinical control trial or something like that. But that's for drugs. That's not for nutrition. So what I'm saying, the evidence we have, these correlations, highly significant. We got this, and put it all together.
Mm-hmm.
It gives me a great deal of confidence.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is true.
I mean, there's one more thing that I mean, I could keep asking you questions for hours on end, and maybe we'll get a chance to do this again sometime. But one more thing that I really wanted to hear your perspective on before we wrap up here. As I fully admit, you know, not a scientist, trying my best to look into the science that's going on around nutrition and make sense of it all. One of the things that I am concerned with, and I think a lot of people outside of the scientific community and perhaps inside the scientific community are concerned with, is sort of the integrity of the science that's being done these days and the scientific discussion that is happening or perhaps not being allowed to happen for various reasons. I guess what I mean is, how much research is being done these days that is really honest research, where people are they're trying to figure something out for the purpose of making humanity, making the world a better place. And how much is that research perhaps not really happening because funding for certain research is trying to get certain things to be proven. If you sort of know what I'm getting at. Like, I guess what I'd like to say, to hear your perspective on is, how healthy is science, like the state of science and research that's being done right now? What are your thoughts on maybe what could perhaps change in the way that things are being discussed? I mean, the points you raised are great points. And when you turn on the news and you see everybody talking about vaccines and masks, and I haven't heard anybody talking about nutrition or anything like that. It's not in the discussion, looking at antibodies. What do you say to the scientific community in a time like this? What would you like to see the discussion, looking more like? Any comments on in that regard?
Yeah, let me describe science in two ways. It's a great question. I've spent a whole career sort of thinking about this, especially in policy. The kind of science, when I talk about science, I'm talking about the idealistic form of science, where you make an observation, you form a hypothesis, you test it, you are willing to take criticism, you adjust back and forth, that kind of science. That's really nice. Remove our subjectivity as much as possible, just looking at facts, okay? That's the ideal. That happens. There's some communities we can that sort of thing happens. Unfortunately, and this has been changing just during my own lifetime, the science that's being done in academic institutions in particular, which was public money, let's say. All of my research, I got generous amounts of funding for many, many years. It was all public money. I took none from industry, number one. I published it, in the very best journals. It was all peer reviewed. So I had my colleagues looked at it, decided whether I get published. That kind of science, unfortunately, I was able to do that because I had what is called tenure for many years. I got my tenure when I was in my 30s, actually. And so that gave me academic freedom, so I could speak my mind. So I didn't depend on any source of funding from the outside. I'm not representing anyone. I'm just looking at basically science. Unfortunately, a lot of my colleagues these days don't have that opportunity because tenure has been declining, really seriously declining. And I don't know how much of this I know for Canada, but certainly for the United States, it's been a horrific trend in my mind.
Why is that?
Well, because now, if you don't have tenure, then you can get hired to teach whatever they want you to teach. You can't stray outside the boundaries very much. Obviously, I've been straying outside the boundaries for my entire career on various every things. And I've been able to do it because I had tenure. I felt protected. I mean, people have had to try, and they've been formally get me thrown out of my profession or, dismissed from the university. Those kind of pressures exist. I was able to withstand them because I had tenure. I said, just go jump on a lake. I'm going to do what I want to do. But on the other hand, for many of the younger people going into academia these days, they're not protected for that. They might be hired for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever, given an appointment or something of that sort. They kind of stay within the boundaries. If they stray a little bit beyond what the university might be interested in, or beyond what the public is willing to accept, they get fired. They certainly won't get renewed. Their appointment will not be renewed. So unfortunately, the kind of science that we're now living with is tainted. In some cases, it's tainted very badly because it's funded by industry, and they want the scientists to teach it, to find something they find interesting. But a lot of other science is quite good in many ways, as long as it doesn't stray beyond the more sacred boundaries. And unfortunately, there are some sacred boundaries. I call them edges of paradigms that really do exist. And if they cross that line and they don't have tenure, then their chances of getting renewed appointment are much, much less. So I can understand your concern as a member of the public, and that's unfortunately the way it is. And the public is being cheated. So I've worked at the policy area I did for about 20 years in this country and elsewhere. And so I know how policy forms and the policies that we get, like dietary guidelines, for example. The United States and Canada cooperated on one occasion for that, but in any case, the kind of dietary guidelines we have are very important because they tend to set the standards against which you judge school lunch programs. You judge all kinds of things by these policies. And those policies, at the end of the day, they're issued by government. Scientists are on committees to make recommendations. But in the final analysis, they're issued by government, and government, at least in the United States, much less so in Canada, but certainly true in this country, we have the best politicians that money can buy.
Hmm.
So politicians are prisoners of the economic system.
Right.
It's that simple. I want to be very blunt about that, and absolute about we have a system by which politicians, in large measure, have to pay attention to who's paying for their election. Now, when the government has the final say of what the dietary guidelines should be, you can guess the people in charge are responding to the politicians who appoint them. So, we are, in many ways, we're a prisoner to a system that now, in my view, is unfortunately, it's pretty corrupt. People are learning things, they're hearing things according to what the system wants to hear and do. I know I'm being pretty maybe acid about this, maybe too candid, but that's what I've seen. I'm telling you that about in the new book that I'm now publishing, some of that. And there are certain things we could do. Canada, let me make one remark for your Canadian audience, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Really interesting. The Canadian authorities and the American authorities kind of joined forces a bit. I know there was a time to issue a joint dietary guidelines kind of thing. Fortunately, the Canadians kind of did their own thing because the Canadians, they've issued these statements every 5 years. So the last round, the Canadians had the audacity and the courage to actually say something that's really deviates from the norm. They cautioned the public about consuming too much dairy.
Yes.
The United States did not do that. Canada did. So I say yay for Canada.
Yeah, we have to give credit.
Yeah, that's what you give credit what credit's due. They were running against some headwinds, obviously, to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But
Big
they
time.
did it. They did it. And I give a big hand to the Canadians for doing that.
Me too.
We just need to, and that goes back to the political system Canada has, quite frankly, compared to ours. I think the Canadian system, I've lectured most of the universities in Canada, actually, or the medical schools. And the Canadian system, as I'm sure you know, I see it from the outside, so you can, look at me as an outsider making this comment, but the Canadian system is somewhat more socialistic, which has a meaning for me, because they're a little more conscious of serving the system. There's places they have problems too, like we both have problems, but they're encumbered to some extent. But they are a little easier for them to be bolder and look after the citizens.
I've actually I've got a meeting with my local MP next week where I'm looking to discuss. There's a movement in Canada. Shout out to Nation Rising, who their mission is to end subsidies for animal agriculture in Canada. So I'm kind of interested to see if there's anything that I can do that can be done to sort of end that. But I mean, look, it's sort of, if we could get that done where dairy was basically removed from, you were speaking about sort of basically the dietary guidelines that are put out every 5 years by the government. Right. And so what happened was the last one that was put out, for people who may not be familiar with, dairy was its own sort of food group, right? Or like milk or whatever it said before that, they were recommending dairy, and then they took it off. So now, I mean, maybe you can talk about the change they made of it. I know we'll wrap this up soon here, but that was basically the gist of it, right? Is they took dairy off.
They just they inferred, question about the so-called health value of dairy.
Right.
And that's what makes it that.
Yeah.
made people start to think. I know the dairy industry reacted
They were not
against it.
happy.
They were not happy, so that's the way it is.
Yeah.
But we have to have more of that if we're going to save this world, for one
Yeah.
thing.
Well, that's perhaps a good note to end on there. Some positivity. There is progress being made, and again, I just want to thank you so much for your time today. I mean, is there anything else you wanted to add in before we wrap up today? Maybe some
No,
parting words.
just tell you keep up your work. That's all. You
Thank.
got you're a young guy, and you got lots of years ahead of you. We've got to solve problems, and I think that the biggest problem of all may be the effect of food consumption on the environment. That is probably the number one thing right now, because if we don't have an environment left, then talking about all these other things are moot. And there's really good evidence that the consumption of livestock and livestock products is the number one cause of environmental problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's from the United Nations. So that's a really big issue. And that means consuming more plant-based foods, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's so many reasons, and obviously, nutrition is one big one. And yeah, you've done just so much work to promoting this plant-based eating, whole food plant-based diets. And whenever anybody is forced to answer the question, where do you get your protein? It's
They're from
because
plants.
you get it from plants.
Plenty
End of
of plants.
story.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Right.